You have no authority to question what this board decides to do with community property. Margaret Whitman's voice dripped with venom as she leaned across the podium at me. Her perfectly manicured fingers stabbed the air like a weapon. Your precious little tree was blocking the sight lines for our new landscaping vision. Deal with it. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. 23 years I'd lived in Oak Ridge Commons. 23 years I'd watched that oak tree grow from a sapling I planted myself into a magnificent 40-footer that shaded half my backyard. And this woman, this power-drunk tyrant who'd moved in 2 years ago, had just admitted they cut it down without permission. That tree was on my property line, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You had no right. We had every right, she cut me off, her smile sharp as broken glass. And if you don't like how we run things around here, maybe you should consider moving somewhere more suitable for people who can't follow community standards. That's when I knew Margaret Whitman had just declared war on the wrong landscaper. See, I'm Dave Morrison and I've been in the tree and landscape business for 30 years. I know every permit, every regulation, every loophole in this county's environmental codes. What Margaret didn't know was that her new landscaping vision was about to become her worst nightmare. But let me back up and tell you exactly how we got here. Margaret Whitman looked like she'd stepped out of a 1950s country club catalog. Perfectly pressed blazer, pearl earrings, and that kind of helmet hair that could survive a hurricane. But underneath that polished exterior lurked something far more dangerous. A woman who'd tasted power and decided she needed more. She'd moved into Oak Ridge Commons just 2 years ago, but within 6 months she'd somehow clawed her way onto the HOA board. Within a year she was president. The woman was like a virus, spreading her influence through carefully orchestrated coffee dates and volunteer committees until half the neighborhood was either terrified of her or completely under her spell. In public, Margaret was all smiles and community spirit. She organized charity drives and holiday decorations with the enthusiasm of a Disney princess. But behind closed doors she was more like Cruella de Vil, calculating, cruel, and absolutely convinced that the rules didn't apply to her. The real Margaret emerged when she thought no one important was watching. She'd berate the mailman for delivering packages inappropriately, threaten landscapers with violations for parking on the street, and send passive-aggressive letters to anyone whose grass was a quarter-inch too long. Power had corrupted her completely, and now she wielded the HOA like her personal army. What made her truly dangerous wasn't just her cruelty, it was her intelligence. Margaret knew exactly how to work the system, how to make her personal vendettas look like community improvements. She was the kind of villain who could smile sweetly while driving a knife between your ribs. I was in Denver for 3 days, consulting on a major commercial landscaping project. 3 days. That's all it took for Margaret to strike. I pulled into my driveway Thursday evening, exhausted but satisfied with a job well done. The late afternoon sun was streaming through my backyard at an angle that seemed all wrong. Something was missing from the familiar silhouette of my property line. Then I saw it. Or rather, I saw what wasn't there anymore. My oak tree, my beautiful, mature oak tree that I'd planted when my son was born, was gone. Not trimmed. Not pruned. Gone. A pathetic pile of logs and branches sat stacked where 40 feet of majestic tree had stood that morning. I stood there in my driveway, briefcase still in hand, staring at the devastation. That tree had been more than landscaping. It was a living monument to my family's life in this neighborhood. My wife Sarah had carved our initials in its bark on our 5th wedding anniversary. My kids had built a treehouse in its branches. It had shaded our backyard barbecues and our quiet morning coffees for over 2 decades. Now it was firewood. A bright orange notice was staked in the ground where the tree had stood. Community Landscaping Improvement, authorized by HOA Board. The arrogance was breathtaking. They hadn't even tried to hide what they'd done. I walked closer and saw the truth that made my blood boil. The tree had been perfectly healthy. The cut was clean through solid, disease-free wood. They hadn't removed it for safety or health reasons. They'd murdered it in cold blood. That's when I knew this wasn't just about landscaping. This was about power, control, and making an example out of anyone who dared to question Margaret Whitman's authority. She'd chosen the wrong example. The next morning, I knocked on Margaret's door with a manila folder full of property surveys and legal documents. I was going to handle this like a civilized adult, give her one chance to make this right. Margaret answered the door in her silk robe, coffee mug in hand, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Dave, what can I do for you?" "You can explain why you cut down my tree without permission," I said, keeping my voice level. "And then you can tell me how you plan to make this right." Her expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching amusement. "Your tree? That tree was impacting the community sight lines for our new entrance landscaping. The board voted and we acted within our authority. I opened the folder and pulled out the property survey. This survey shows that tree was 18 inches inside my property line. You had no authority to touch it. Margaret barely glanced at the documents. I think you'll find that all landscaping visible from community areas falls under HOA purview. Perhaps you should review your covenants more carefully. Margaret, that tree was 23 years old. It was worth thousands of dollars and you destroyed it without even asking. I'm trying to handle this reasonably. Reasonably? She laughed, actually laughed. Dave, let me explain something to you. This community has standards. Some people understand that and some people fight every improvement we try to make. Which kind of person are you going to be? The threat was crystal clear. Fall in line or face the consequences. I want the tree replaced, I said. Full-size, professional installation, the works. And I want a written apology from the board. Margaret's smile turned predatory. Good luck with that. The board meets next Thursday if you'd like to file a formal complaint. I'm sure we'll give it all the consideration it deserves. As I walked away, I heard her door slam behind me. Margaret Whitman had just made the biggest mistake of her HOA presidency. She thought she was dealing with just another cowed homeowner. She had no idea she just declared war on someone who understood exactly how the game was really played. I called my lawyer that afternoon. Tom Bradley had handled my business contracts for 15 years, and he owed me a favor from when I'd saved his company's reputation with an emergency landscape restoration. They cut down a mature oak on your property? Tom's voice was incredulous. Dave, that's not just an HOA overreach, that's destruction of property. Possibly criminal. Within 2 hours, Tom had drafted a letter that was beautiful in its legalese precision. Demand for compensation, threat of civil action, requirement for board meeting minutes, the whole 9 yards. But Tom and I both knew that legal threats alone wouldn't be enough to bring down someone like Margaret. She'll lawyer up, Tom warned me. And HOA litigation can drag on for years. You want real results, you need leverage. I spent that weekend doing what I do best, research. I pulled every permit, every environmental impact study, every county record I could find for Oak Ridge Commons. 30 years in the landscaping business had taught me that developers always cut corners, and HOAs almost never bothered to maintain proper documentation. What I found was pure gold. Our new entrance landscaping, that Margaret was so proud of? The elaborate fountain and decorative plantings that had cost the community $60,000? Not a single permit on file with the county. Not for the electrical work, not for the water features, not for the grading that had altered the natural drainage. But that was just the beginning. I started mapping out every improvement Margaret's board had made in the past 18 months. The decorative stone walls along the main road. The expanded parking areas. The new mailbox clusters. Project after project, all done without proper permits, all potential violations of county environmental codes. Margaret thought she held all the cards because she controlled the HOA. What she didn't realize was that there was a bigger game being played, and I knew the rules better than she did. Tom's letter hit the HOA like a legal thunderbolt. Within 48 hours, Margaret had fired back with her own lawyer, some expensive suit from downtown who specialized in community association matters. His response was everything I'd expected. Dismissive, condescending, and completely unaware of what they were really dealing with. But Margaret wasn't content to let the lawyers handle things. She wanted to send a message. The first violation notice appeared on my door 3 days later. Lawn maintenance violation. Grass exceeds maximum height requirements. I walked outside and measured my lawn with a ruler. 2 3/4 inches. The HOA requirement was 3 inches maximum. Margaret was citing me for grass that was a 1/4 inch too short. The next day, vehicle parking violation, commercial vehicle parked in residential driveway. My work truck, which had been parked in the same spot for 15 years without a single complaint. Day 3, exterior decoration violation, seasonal decorations displayed outside approved timeframe. My Halloween pumpkins. In October. Margaret was unleashing the full power of her petty tyranny, and she was doing it publicly. Every violation notice was copied to the entire board. Every fine was announced in the community newsletter. She wanted everyone to see what happened to people who challenged her authority. The neighbors started avoiding eye contact when I walked to my mailbox. The morning joggers who used to wave crossed to the other side of the street. Margaret's message was being received loud and clear. This is what happens when you fight the HOA. But Margaret made one critical error in her campaign of harassment. She pushed too hard, too fast, and she got sloppy. That Halloween decoration violation? She dated it wrong, claiming my pumpkins were still up in November when the notice was actually written in mid-October. That parking violation? My truck was at a job site the entire day. She claimed it was illegally parked. Margaret's desperation to destroy me was creating a paper trail of her own incompetence and abuse of power. She was handing me the ammunition I needed to take her down, and she didn't even realize it. The real war was about to begin. I waited until the following Monday morning to make my move. Margaret's harassment campaign had been going on for 2 weeks, and she was feeling confident. She'd even mentioned to a neighbor that she was considering calling the county about my non-compliant business operations. That's when I dropped the hammer. At exactly 9 a.m., a county environmental inspector named Rick Martinez pulled up to our community entrance in his official vehicle. Rick and I had worked together on dozens of commercial projects over the years, and he'd been very interested when I'd called to report some potential permitting issues in my neighborhood. Rick spent 3 hours documenting every unpermitted improvement Margaret's board had installed. The fountain system that was dumping treated water into storm drains. The decorative walls that blocked natural drainage patterns. The expanded parking areas that exceeded impervious surface ratios. Every single project was a violation of county environmental codes. But the real masterpiece was the entrance landscaping itself. Margaret's vision included exotic plant species that weren't on the county's approved list, irrigation systems that violated water usage ordinances, and grading that had altered the natural watershed flow. The environmental impact was extensive, and none of it had been properly reviewed or permitted. By noon, Rick had issued a stop work order for all ongoing landscaping projects and a notice of violation for the existing unpermitted improvements. The fountain was shut down immediately. The decorative lighting was disconnected. The community's crown jewel, Margaret's $60,000 monument to her own ego, was suddenly a $60,000 liability. I was trimming my perfectly regulation height grass when Margaret came storming across the street. Her face was red, her hair was disheveled, and she was clutching the county notices like they were on fire. "You did this," she screamed loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "You called the county on your own community." I shut off my mower and looked at her calmly. I reported what appeared to be unpermitted construction work. It's my civic duty as a resident. This is harassment. This is retaliation. "Margaret," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the lawn, "if your board had obtained proper permits for their projects, there wouldn't be any problem. But since you seem to believe that rules don't apply to you." She was practically vibrating with rage. "You have no idea what you've started." "No idea." I smiled. "Actually, Margaret, I know exactly what I've started. And you haven't seen anything yet." The county violations were just the opening act. While Margaret scrambled to deal with the permitting crisis, I was working on something much bigger. Linda Chin lived 3 houses down from Margaret and had served on the HOA board until Margaret's hostile takeover. Linda had resigned in protest, but she'd kept copies of everything. Meeting minutes, financial records, email chains that showed exactly how Margaret operated behind closed doors. "She's been falsifying board votes," Linda told me over coffee, sliding a folder across my kitchen table. "Look at the meeting minutes from March. She claims the tree removal was voted on and approved, but there were only 3 board members present, and Tom Rodriguez voted against it. That's not a valid quorum, and it wasn't a majority approval." The documents were damning. Margaret had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, making unilateral decisions and then creating fake board approval after the fact. The tree removal was just one example. She'd approved the fountain project, the decorative lighting, and half a dozen other expensive improvements without proper board oversight. But Linda had saved the best for last. She's been paying her landscaping company double rate for basic maintenance and splitting the difference with the contractor. Look at these invoices. The financial records showed a pattern of kickbacks and inflated contracts that had cost the community thousands of dollars. Margaret wasn't just drunk on power, she was profiting from it. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" I asked. Linda looked ashamed. "Who was I going to report it to? The board she controls? The management company she hired?" Margaret made sure she was untouchable. "She made one mistake," I said, studying the documents. "She cut down my tree. That gave me standing to dig into everything else." Linda smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to give Margaret exactly what she deserves. And I'm going to do it in front of the entire community." The emergency HOA meeting was Margaret's idea. She wanted to address the crisis created by my vindictive county report and restore confidence in the board's leadership. She had no idea she was walking into her own execution. The community center was packed. Word had spread about the county violations and people wanted answers. Margaret took the podium looking perfectly composed, ready to spin the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding that she would graciously resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight because one disgruntled resident has chosen to attack our community rather than work within proper channels. I let her talk for 5 minutes, giving her enough rope. Then I stood up. Point of order, Madam President. Before we discuss the county violations, shouldn't we address the fact that the tree removal was never properly authorized by the board? Margaret's composure flickered. The board voted. According to these meeting minutes, there was no valid quorum. I held up Linda's documents. And the one board member who was present voted against the removal. A murmur went through the crowd. Margaret's carefully prepared speech was crumbling. That's not accurate. The vote was valid. Then you won't mind if we review the recording? I pulled out my phone and hit play. Margaret's own voice filled the room, crystal clear from the meeting where she'd admitted they'd cut down the tree without permission. Her arrogant dismissal of property rights, her threats, her complete disregard for community input, it was all there. The room erupted. 23 years of Margaret's accumulated enemies suddenly found their voices. Stories poured out of manipulated votes, suppressed complaints, and financial irregularities. The woman who'd ruled through fear and intimidation was watching her empire collapse in real time. This is a witch hunt. Margaret screamed over the chaos. I've done nothing but improve this community. Improve it? I stood up, my voice cutting through the noise. You've cost us thousands in unpermitted construction. You've violated environmental regulations. You've falsified board votes and profited from inflated contracts. I laid out the evidence methodically, the financial records, the forged approvals, the pattern of abuse that had been hidden for months. With each revelation, Margaret seemed to shrink a little more. Finally, board member Tom Rodriguez stood up. Margaret, I move for your immediate resignation and a full audit of all community finances. Seconded, came from multiple voices. Margaret looked around the room at faces that had once smiled and nodded at her every word. Now they were hostile, angry, betrayed. Her kingdom of fear had crumbled in a single evening. You'll regret this, she said, gathering her papers with shaking hands. All of you will regret this. But her voice carried no authority anymore. Margaret Whitman was finished. Margaret resigned the next morning, effective immediately. By the end of the week, the community had hired a forensic accountant who confirmed everything Linda and I had suspected, thousands of dollars in fraudulent expenses, kickbacks, and misappropriated funds. The new board, led by Tom Rodriguez, moved quickly to clean house. They terminated the Sweetheart Landscaping contract, hired a reputable management company, and began the process of obtaining proper permits for all community improvements. The county agreed to work with us on bringing everything into compliance, and the fountain was redesigned to meet environmental standards. As for my tree, the community voted unanimously to replace it with a mature oak of the same species, professionally installed at HOA expense. But more than that, they planted a memorial grove along the main entrance, 7 oak trees representing the 7 families who'd been harassed or driven out by Margaret's reign of terror. The new trees went in on a perfect October morning, their roots nestled in rich soil where Margaret's unpermitted fountain had once stood. I stood watching the installation crew work, thinking about how sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemy, it's about building something better from the wreckage they leave behind. My neighbor Tom walked over as the crew was finishing up. Dave, I owe you an apology. We all knew Margaret was out of control, but nobody wanted to be the one to stand up to her. It's okay, I said, watching the crane position the last tree. Sometimes it takes losing something important to find the courage to fight back. The oak saplings looked small in their new home, but I knew what they would become given time. In 20 years, they'd shade the entrance with the same majesty my old tree had brought to my backyard. Kids would climb their branches, couples would carve their initials in their bark, and they'd stand as living proof that bullies don't get to have the last word. Margaret Whitman had taught our community an important lesson. Power without accountability is just tyranny waiting to happen. But she'd also taught us something else, that ordinary people, when they've finally had enough, can move mountains. Or in this case, they can move trees. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. The morning sun filtered through the new branches and I smiled. My tree was gone, but its legacy was just beginning.